Well, it's a very strange feeling, of course, for all sorts of reasons. As Peter said, even these rooms have resonances. This is the room in which I had my wedding celebration with Sarah. Next door was the room where we had this seminar in 1976-7. The first session was chaired by Keith Thomas. The last session was chaired by Peter Burke. Or the other way around. No, it was that way around. So, and since then I've had parties for launches of books, and we've had apartment dinners here with Fraser lecturers. The rooms are resonant. Even the paintings, Roger Fry mainly, are paintings I have in my room in another part of the college. So that, plus then obviously on top of that, the fact that I've got these generations of my life. I've got my first DPhil supervisor, Keith, who gave me a second at Oxford. Collective judgment. I remember being amazed by his very smart gown when I went in for my interview, which is mainly what I remember of that interview. The other thing, well, I'll come back to management memories in a minute, but anyway, there's that generation of my teachers, and of course, probably the two leading influences on my intellectual life, living ones, are Keith and Jack Goody, who was professor, whose department I joined in. I was his first appointment, and he became kind of anthropological equivalent of Keith as my father and patron and mentor, and in their presence, of course, you're always slightly in awe. So there's that generation. Then there's the generation of my contemporaries, very well represented by Caroline and Jeff and other Jeffs and so on, and Peter here, with whom I've worked, and who have influenced me sideways enormously, and Johnny Parry and others. And then at the end we had one of my students, my contemporary students. So three sedimentations or layers, and all this history. So it's very difficult to know quite what to say. Perhaps what I'll do is just quickly go through one or 2 points, or perhaps just 1 point with each presentation. With Carrie, I wanted to thank her very much indeed for a very generous, warm and thoughtful piece. I have a horror of Foucault and Derrida, so I was delighted that I had no overlap from at all. I just bought a book called Hallucinating Foucault. I'm just trying to cure myself entirely of first. But the question, the question of recording, and the particular question was raised about how this series of interviews, which has now reached about 150 on the web, and one of the very next ones we hope will be Keith here, and about 3 or 4 of you have been interviewed for this series here. It started with Jack Goody, of course. He actually, it probably started in that seminar here in 1976-7 when the ABA filmed what I took to be the beginning of a new kind of recording of seminars, and so I had the chance to assemble people like Maurice Godelier, Maurice Bloch, Raphael Samuel, E.P. Thompson, all the people I wanted to meet and hear, and I thought it would be nice to film them, so we did, and that's all on the web for information. And Jack was there and helped a lot, and then I think that may have given him the idea that with Stephen Levinson in 1982, he would interview some of the elderly acquaintances and colleagues of his, so Audrey Richards, Srini Vas, and someone else who escapes me, Maya Fortis. He then retired and stopped doing that, and I started, whoever suggested my motives changed and that I might have started in a more Foucaultian and directed way is probably right, because it started really partly because, like Jack, I thought it would be sad, all this wisdom, all this knowledge of these people. And the first was my supervisor, Christoph von Führer-Heimdorf, and Piers is here as another of his students. I felt, he'd experienced so much, how sad not to have him talking about it we'd read about it, but we'd never know what the man was like. So I started early with Christoph and 1 or 2 other people. So it's partly for that reason, future generations read it. The second was that being someone who'd moved from history into anthropology, I really still wasn't quite sure what anthropologists did or what they were or what the subject was, and I thought if I listened to a lot of them talking to me on film I might find out. So it was partly educational. And the other reason was that in a sense I was both inside this tribe, but having come from the outside I was intrigued by their network and the tribe itself. And so I looked at it, as many anthropologists do, as a tribe, and it was at that time very much a tribe, because all these people were taught by each other, they knew each other. So the interviews became, which were mainly of British social anthropologists at that time, all linked with each other. They would talk about this person, that person. They loved gossip, anthropologists loved gossip, being a small community, so I got a lot of the gossip, and it was very intriguing hearing them talking about. And some of them, the oldest ones, like Lucy Mayer and others, went back to the 30s, 20s, 30s. I got stories of the Malinowski seminars and so on. And these were useful in the after dinner conversations and so on as well, but they were fun. And so I went on without any real plan. I think what protected me against Foucault in any direction really was that there was absolutely no use for this activity. I was recording it on low-band pneumatic, which couldn't be played back easily. No one would watch it except a few unwilling students. If I forced them into a seminar room and said you're going to watch an hour or 2 of this ancient dead white male, then they would watch it. But on the whole, they just gathered in a dusty row on my shelf in the department. And then it was only really about 6 or 7 years ago, with the onset of the web, Apple Macintosh editing systems, better cameras, all sorts of things, that I suddenly realised how useful this thing was. I knew somehow in the future, and this is perhaps an odd feature of my life, I've often tried to do things well before there's been any obvious purpose for them. It's a bit like sort of Japanese development of technology, which no one could see any purpose for until much later. So I did this, and then suddenly the web came along. And the principle of selection was that they were a generation above me, preferably, that they were quite well known, but someone else also perhaps had recommended them. And it worked on a network basis. Someone might interview someone and they say, oh, you must interview so-and-so and so on. People wanted to hear about it. For a time, the supply of subjects began to dry up because rumour got around that soon after being interviewed by me, you would die. Don't listen to this, Keith. So it did happen that several of them died, but this was because they were in their 80s or whatever. And what has happened over time was that the age came down, so that I am now interviewing my contemporaries, and the pool of anthropologists began to dry up somewhat. And in fact, it was 2 fellows in King's who 2 years ago, Herbert Huppert, an astrophysicist, and Gabriel Horn, or Ned Pat Bateson, the zoologist, suggested that this was such a wonderful thing to do in anthropology, and I had done some historians like Peter was earlier on. Why not do other people? And here it was completely serendipitous. I had 2 or 3 advisors like Gabriel Horn at Bateson, and they say you must do so-and-so, you must do Fred Sanger, the double Nobel Prize winner, you must do Sir Andrew Huxley, you must do Anthony Hewish, and so on, Martin Rees. So there were some obvious people. So, but once I started on scientists, of course, why just scientists? So why not literary critics? So George Steiner or Frank Leonard or other people in different disciplines, economists. So it's expanded, and I ought to mention that most of the work on this series, not done by me, I just sit with a camera and listen to them for a couple of hours, but Sarah, who's here, does the very, very much more time-consuming, difficult work of making a detailed summary, which can then be searched and is indexed on the web by Google. So we do it as a partnership, and that also is part of the function now, because she's at home, I'm here, I'm talking to people, we go back, and then we watch the interview. If I can just plug one for you now. I recently did, someone who, again, another reason, he was at Sedbergh, which is the school I was at, a few years ahead of me. He became Lord Chief Justice, Lord Bingham, and I interviewed him. And he was one of the oddnesses of these interviews, right from the beginning, is how a camera doesn't inhibit you, but it actually draws you out, and people become very relaxed. Some people talk for 2 hours without me asking a question. The only person who's really done this is Geoffrey Lloyd, I think. I think I did ask you a couple of questions, but Geoffrey had it all mentally mapped out very well in his mind. Some people, like the mathematician Sir Peter Swinnerton Dyer, every sentence, they say a sentence and then they look at you and you call in your mathematics and ask another question. But Bingham, I would recommend, he's just gone up. Very interesting man, and he talks very eloquently about why the war, the invasion of Iraq, was illegal by international law. He was the greatest judge in the 20th century. He also talks, he was the head of the law lords who made torture illegal under any circumstances in English courts, and he talks about why torture is not to be allowed in English courts. Those are two high points. So basically, it allowed itself to grow. It just grew by serendipity. So the answer really is that it is an Foucauldian endeavour. Moving on to Keith's very nice and kind remarks. I was terrified of what Keith would say. I'm going to tell you what I thought he was going to say, which is that when Keith was editor of Fontana Past Masters, Past Masters, I had the trepidation to think that I would try and introduce the West to the greatest Japanese philosopher and thinker, Fukazawa Yukichi. And I'd written half a book about Fukazawa with friends. I mean, I couldn't do it on my own, but I don't speak or write any Japanese, of course. So it was written entirely from the outside. So I wrote enthusiastically to Keith, saying, how about a past master on Fukazawa? And Keith wrote me a small postcard saying, it's a delightful idea, Alan, I'm sure you do it very well. But I didn't know you read or wrote Japanese. So that I thought his paper today would be, Alan writes delightfully about the Middle Ages, which he knows not a great deal. Of course, true. I think, apropos what he said, is absolutely right and fair, and the whole thing is a fair account of my young attempt to shake up the paradigm of Marx and Weber and so on. It was a young man's book. It was written in 2 or 3 months, starting on the 7th of the 7th, 1977, and written within 2 months. What might be interesting to you is to know why, in a sense, I think I wrote it. It's half right and half wrong, like most books. And I think the reason I was able to write in that way was the result of 2 or 3 things. One was shifting disciplines. I talked to one of the chief sources of my work on medieval England, and I asked him, and this is a rather serious point, I said, I won't name him, I said, why didn't you write this book? Because many people said he should have written this book, because it was his work that I drew on. And he said, well, it would have possibly destroyed my career. If it hadn't destroyed my career, it would have destroyed my PhD students' careers, because the leading thinkers in this field are the people who are attacking, and when they divide with my PhD students, it would be difficult for them. And that's Cambridge in the 1970s, 60s. It's not as extreme as that, but when you're in a discipline, if I had to consider all the consequences of what I wrote, it would have been more difficult, but more theoretically, it was getting back from history, and above all it was going, as I did to the Himalayas, it was going to what I considered to be, it's not exactly a peasant society, but it's a sort of peasant society in Nepal, seeing what peasants are. Now all this quibbling about, well it's not quibbling, but where definitional matters, and there is a big dispute here, and it is true that the definition used by Hilton and others, which is the definition actually also used by Raymond Firth and a number of anthropologists, is one I disagree with. My breakthrough was meeting Theodore Shani and reading the Awkward Class, and then reading his Gillespie and Good European accounts, in particular Chanov, and realizing that it's not a matter of how you produce wealth, agrarian, not agrarian, whether you're small scale, whether you mainly produce food and all this stuff. It is a mode of production. And this was confirmed by many of the classic works by Oscar Lewis and Eric Wolff and so on. Peasants are a different kind of species in many ways. Their mentality, their morality, their mode of production. And so going back to their tools and whether they mainly produce for the market or not, seemed to be not an adequate criteria, and so that's what I tried to set up at the beginning. But it was the experience of going away to another peasant world and seeing how that worked, and then coming back. That was half of it. The other half was that Sarah and I, particularly Sarah, were the first people who'd ever looked at the documents. Now that seems a grand claim, but if Sarah and I, between 1973 and 1982, did the most intensive study that's ever been made of an English village, Earl's Combe, which is all on the web. And although medievalists had looked at one set of documents, sometimes they would look at court rolls or a rental or whatever, they had never taken up the challenge that Maitland had put forward. He said it would be a wonderful day if someone would edit all the manorial records of a single manor for a number of centuries. Apart from the Halifax Court rolls and one or two other instances which are later, no one had ever done this. And Sarah and I spent 8 or 9 years of our lives doing it. We kept back through the maps of the village and the original documents to a world which was unrecognisable in terms of what I had been taught to believe about medieval peasants. That experience, I mean, I couldn't have written the book with any confidence if I hadn't actually handled all those kinds of documents. And I think it also relates to a point that came up in the question to Peter. There was in the 60s, not in the 70s, in the 60s there was an archival revolution. Keith was part of it because Keith sent me to the Essex Record Office. I think I was his first student who went there. And I've just had a letter from one of the archivists there, Arthur Searle, who was there the year before me. And he said that that was a wonderful moment. The Essex Record Office was way ahead of anywhere else in England. The best teachers were there, the best archives were there. And I spent a year there, and then later other of Keith's students were there, studying these. It was just suddenly opened up. You fell through a trapdoor into this world of archives which had been hidden until that point, until the 60s. And the Public Record Office also opened up. They brought in archives into the central London, the Chancery Records and so on. So suddenly you had the materials to ask new questions of, and we were trying to do this sort of thing that Peter mentioned, which is that we were trying to get at things which weren't written down directly. We were trying to follow Mark Bloch's admonition of cross-questioning the evidence and extracting things, or Keith's suggestion, reading against the grain, trying to extract new things out of the evidence. It would have been hopeless if the evidence hadn't been there, but things like Ralph Justin's diary, which we worked on, and all these court records and parish registers and archdeaconry, particularly ecclesiastical court records, gave you insights into morality and mentality, which had been impossible in the 50s. It was the result of the local history revolution that W.G. Hoskins and others had pioneered. So it was a very, very fortunate time, coming together of anthropology and history and new sources. So that's another phase. Moving on perhaps to after the break, after the coffee break, moving on to Peter's talk. I think I'm very grateful to him for that, and he's been a great influence and encouragement to me, because as you probably just sort of gathered, he's a wonderful linguist, works all over Europe. He's entirely insular, and also against the advice of the history faculty, he does introduce some theory into some of his work and brought the Alan school to his country. So he was a tremendous inspiration for me. And his account, oral history of why we became interested in anthropology, I think was exactly the same experience as I did. I remember at the end of my undergraduate degree at Oxford, there were little bits of the Oxford course that I really loved. I liked the political theory, which Keith taught me, lectured me on. I enjoyed some of the economic history, but a lot of it was quite dry, I felt. I kept asking my teachers, where is the emotions? Where are the books I can read on? And I remember going, I didn't do it as an undergraduate, but the day I finished my exams, everyone else went off to drink champagne. But being a workaholic, I went back into the bottom here, and I got out Preservate Smith's book on, I always used to think it was Preserve, I think it's Preservate. Preservate Smith's book on witchcraft, and read it. And that opened out a whole new thing. So suddenly I realised I could actually research all the things that I hadn't been taught as an undergraduate. And I remember going to see Christopher Hill, who was appointed as my supervisor, and saying, could I study either Arthurian legend, or witchcraft, or sex? And he looked at me and said, oh, well, Keith Thomas knows more about sex than I do. In the 17th century. And also witchcraft. I had to do something years ago, and on Anglo-Saxon and medieval history. And all the time, it wasn't just his talk, unpublished talk, all the time he used to say, Alan, you're saying it's changed. What's changed? How has it changed? I remember I got so exasperated in the end with James going on about how nothing had changed from the Anglo-Saxons to the present, that I rushed up to in his room where I was being supervised, and I pointed at the lights and I said, did the Anglo-Saxons have electricity then? So nothing had changed, but not much. So he really indoctrinated me with this. And then I also must have got it at school, because I want to pay tribute to my history master at Bio at Sedbergh, who also taught this, Lord Chief Justice, and many others. And he had been taught before the war and just after the war by Oxford medievalists. And none of this great change argument or idea had come in then. So when I wrote Individualism, he wrote to me as my old schoolmaster after many years, he said, Alan, I don't know what you're fighting against. I taught you all this. Where have all these funny Marxists come from? I had the same experience here with the great legal historian John Baker, and when I told him the thesis of individualism, he said, of course you're right. Where did this other, I've never heard of all this other stuff, which was what I was fighting against. So, history and anthropology, but what I really liked, whether it should be called anthropological history or historical anthropology, I don't know, but what I really got to the point in my life, of course, as most of us have now, the older of us, we don't really know what we are. We follow Mark Bloch's advice, which is to pursue problems or human flesh, as the giant did in the Berries Club. And so, wherever that takes you, so sometimes I'm a demographic historian with, as Geoffrey Hawthorne knows, and sometimes I'm a political theorist. It's the problem, the question, which, how that comes up in one's mind, one doesn't know, but the question comes up and then you follow wherever that leads you. And so you can rove around, and that's the wonderful thing that I found about Cambridge and about my colleagues here, that particularly, perhaps that's the point to move on to Jack Goody. What was wonderful about Jack, he was my first head of department, and also a model for me in many ways. He was a wonderful local politician, and he built up our department. He did more for our department than anyone has done since, which is not always recognised, but I saw him in action, and he got new posts, and he restructured, in fact, the department was first divided off because of Jack. So he was politically very important to us, but intellectually he just roamed anywhere he liked. And I often tell my students now to be like Jack in the sense of what we teach in anthropology of Switten cultivators, slash and burn. What Jack did was he would work on something for 2 or 3 years, 4 years, and then he would stop and write the book, and then he would move on to something else. I mean, even since he retired, he's written, I think, 18 books. And Julia tells me he's written 3 books this year. He's just about to have his 90th birthday. And they were always on wide-ranging different themes. They weren't always, not everyone always agreed with them, but they were always in search of something, and he just went where his nose took him. And this energy and interest in everything, which meant that he shaped a department which Caroline and I were involved in, which was not particularly sectarian, and it welcomed people from outside in all sorts of respects, and they just continued, I'm glad to say, to this day. And we have our present head of the department here, as very open. I remember only twice in my experience. Once at the LSE, when I was at Malinowski's, after Malinowski really first took over, and we had a visitor from Australia, and he used to sit at meetings saying, you can't say that, that's not anthropological, or something like this. And Raymond used to say, no, they can say what they like, as graduate students. I also had a colleague in our department who was the only one who used to occasionally say, well, that's not anthropology, you can't allow that person to do that thesis. But there was only one, and on the whole we could just roam where we liked. On Jack's particular argument, what you will have noticed, I think the one weakness in the presentation that I noticed is this metaphor of a race. He's quite rightly against teleology, but another variant of it is that some people are ahead and some people are behind, and some people are running alongside in parallel and all this sort of stuff. We sort of have to think of that, but it is something we keep having to check. There's no idea that one culture or civilization is ahead of another or is catching up or overtaking it. It is the metaphor, of course, used a lot, and particularly in China and India now, and in Japan in the past. It's a pretty dangerous metaphor, because it suggests there's a goal and there's going to be a point at which someone gets there first. The other thing that perhaps is worth mentioning, when I wonder why he and I disagree on many things so much, and he's always very courteous about it, I think it's something he didn't mention here. I remember when I was talking to John Haynal, who's the person who wrote the European marriage pattern, and he was puzzled. He said, why is Jack so angry and so attacks the Cambridge group and me so much? I said, well, why don't you go and have lunch or meet up with Jack and ask him? And he had a talk to Jack, and afterwards I said, how did it go? He said, fine, I understand it more now. What he's saying is that Eurasia, the whole land across there, is structurally similar. He was very influenced by Gordon Child. Basically, they've all gone through the Neolithic Revolution. And therefore, structurally, at a deep level, they're all the same. And then there's some divergences above that. But Africa didn't go through this. And Africa is very different, because when John Haynal said, how do you know Africa is absolutely different and all of Eurasia is much the same? Jack just said, well, I know. That's the case. And of course, in a sense, he did, because he'd been there. But his great opposition, by having a great opposition between Africa and Eurasia, he was able to diminish the differences within Eurasia, which is a very good thing. And on the other hand, he's caught in a lot of problems. For instance, the most recent big attempt to try and solve this problem of divergences and differences is Pomerantz's work. And Jack is very rude, well, not rude, he's very critical of Pomerantz, I think quite rightly. So he doesn't accept that kind of great divergence theory. So I understand why he and I differ now, but of course I think I'm right and he's wrong.